Imagine walking into a party, a church service, or a job interview, and before anyone asks your name or qualifications, someone holds a brown paper bag next to your face. That bag, something you'd use to carry groceries, becomes the judge of whether you're acceptable. If your skin is lighter than that bag, you're in. If you're darker, the door closes. No discussion, no appeal, just a bag and a judgment. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't ancient history. This was America in the 1900s. And for decades, black communities across the country lived under an invisible rule called the paper bag test. It wasn't written into law. You won't find it in history textbooks alongside Jim Crow statutes. But it shaped lives, careers, marriages, and entire family trees. It determined who got into the best black colleges, who could join prestigious social clubs, who got hired for certain jobs, and even who could worship in certain churches. The paper bag test was colorism at its most brutal and absurd. And the fact that it happened within black communities, not just imposed from the outside, makes it one of the most painful and complicated chapters in American history. Let's go back to understand how a cheap grocery bag became a gatekeeper of opportunity. To understand the paper bag test, you have to understand where it came from. And that story begins long before the 1900s. It begins during slavery. In the antebellum South, enslavers created a hierarchy among enslaved people based on skin tone. Those with lighter skin, often the children of white enslavers who raped enslaved women, were sometimes given different roles. They worked in the house instead of the fields. They learned to read and write, which was forbidden for most enslaved people. They wore better clothes. They ate better food. And when slavery ended, many of these individuals had skills, education, and connections that darker-skinned formerly enslaved people didn't have. This wasn't kindness. This was a deliberate strategy. By creating divisions based on skin color, enslavers weakened solidarity among enslaved people. They made it harder for rebellion to take root, and they planted seeds of colorism that would grow for generations. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, these divisions deepened. Light-skinned black Americans, particularly those who were mixed race and had some access to education or property, formed the core of what would become the black elite. Cities like New Orleans, Charleston, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta developed tight-knit communities of light-skinned black families who controlled much of the economic and social power in black America. They owned businesses. They became doctors, lawyers, teachers. They built churches and social clubs, and in many cases, they only wanted to associate with people who looked like them. This is where the paper bag test enters the picture. The exact origin of the paper bag test is murky. Some historians trace it to New Orleans in the late 1800s, where Creole communities of mixed African, European, and sometimes Native American heritage formed exclusive social circles. Others point to cities like Charleston and Washington, D.C., where similar practices took hold around the same time. What we know for certain is that by the early 1900s, the paper bag test was widespread, and it was enforced with chilling consistency. Here's how it worked. Social organizations, particularly black fraternities and sororities, would literally hold a brown paper bag next to the skin of prospective members during the application or initiation process. If your skin was darker than the bag, you were rejected. No matter how intelligent you were, how wealthy your family was, or how much you could contribute to the organization, your skin tone disqualified you. Churches did this too. Some congregations in cities like Washington, D.C. and Atlanta were known as paper bag churches. If you were darker than the bag, you couldn't join. You couldn't sit in those pews. You couldn't be baptized there. You couldn't marry there. Your darkness was treated as a spiritual and social stain. Nightclubs and social events used variations of the test. The most famous was probably the blue vein test. Doormen would check the inside of your wrist. If they could see blue veins through your skin, you were light enough to enter. If they couldn't, you were turned away. Some clubs used the comb test instead, running a fine-tooth comb through your hair. If the comb passed through easily, your hair was straight enough. If it caught, you were too African to be admitted. Think about the psychological damage this caused. You're a black person in America, already dealing with the violence and humiliation of segregation, already fighting for dignity in a society that treats you as less than human. And then your own community rejects you because you're not light enough, because you're too black. The paper bag test didn't just hurt individuals, it shaped entire institutions. Let's talk about historically black colleges and universities. These schools were supposed to be havens for black students denied admission to white institutions. And for many students, they were. But at some HBCUs, particularly those with roots in the black elite, colorism ran deep. Howard University in Washington, D.C. became notorious for this. Students and alumni from the early 1900s through the 1960s reported that lighter-skinned students were favored for leadership positions, scholarships, and social prestige. Darker-skinned students felt invisible. They described being passed over for campus queens, excluded from certain social clubs, and treated as second-class citizens within a black institution. Spelman College in Atlanta, one of the most prestigious historically black women's colleges, faced similar accusations. So did several other schools. The paper bag test wasn't always formal policy, but it operated through unspoken rules and social pressure that everyone understood. Fraternities and sororities took this even further. The Divine Nine, the 9 historically black Greek letter organizations that form the backbone of black Greek life, all grapple with this history. Some chapters, particularly in certain regions, were known for only accepting light-skinned members well into the 1960s and 1970s. Alpha Kappa Alpha, the first black sorority founded in 1908, faced accusations of colorism for decades. So did Delta Sigma Theta, founded in 1913, partly by women who left AKA over disagreements that included attitudes about skin color and class. The men's fraternities, Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, and Omega Psi Phi, all dealt with internal debates about colorism and who belonged in their organizations. These weren't just social clubs. Greek organizations controlled access to networks, job opportunities, political connections, and marriage prospects. Being excluded because of your skin tone could alter the entire trajectory of your life. And it wasn't just colleges. Professional organizations did this too. Black medical societies, legal associations, and business networks often had unwritten rules about complexion. If you wanted to build a career, you needed connections. And if you were too dark, those connections were harder to make. The paper bag test reached into the most intimate parts of black life. Marriage and family. In many elite black families, there was intense pressure to marry light. Parents discouraged or outright forbade their children from marrying darker-skinned partners. The goal was to lighten the race over generations, to move closer to whiteness and further from blackness. This wasn't just vanity. It was survival strategy wrapped in self-hatred. Light-skinned black people genuinely had more opportunities in segregated America. They were more likely to pass for white when necessary. They faced less immediate violence from white supremacists. They had better access to jobs, housing, and education. So, when a light-skinned mother told her daughter not to bring home a dark-skinned man, she wasn't just being cruel. She was trying to protect future grandchildren from a world that would punish them for being too black. But the cost of that protection was enormous. It fractured families, created deep psychological wounds, and reinforced the racist logic that black features were undesirable. There are heartbreaking stories from this era. Darker-skinned children in light-skinned families who were treated as disappointments or embarrassments. Siblings with different skin tones who were treated completely differently by parents and extended family. Marriages that were discouraged or destroyed because one partner was too dark. The paper bag test wasn't just about who got into a party. It was about who deserved love, respect, and a future. By the 1920s and 1930s, the paper bag test was so embedded in black social life that it was taken for granted in many circles. But it wasn't unopposed. Darker-skinned black people, along with some light-skinned allies, pushed back. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s included artists and intellectuals who celebrated black beauty in all its shades. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes wrote about colorism and its damage. Musicians and performers like Josephine Baker and Paul Robeson rejected European beauty standards. They weren't always successful in changing attitudes, but they planted seeds of resistance. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican political leader who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, explicitly rejected colorism. His movement celebrated dark skin and African heritage. He called out the black elite for their obsession with lightness and European features. Garvey's movement attracted millions of followers in the 1920s, many of them darker-skinned working-class black people who felt excluded by the black bourgeoisie. But Garvey was also controversial and was eventually deported from the United States. And the paper bag test persisted. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought new energy to the fight against colorism. Leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was dark-skinned and working class, became powerful voices. The Black Power movement of the late 1960s and 1970s explicitly rejected white beauty standards. Black is beautiful became a rallying cry. Afros, natural hair, and dark skin were celebrated. Organizations that had practiced the paper bag test faced internal revolutions. Students at Howard University protested colorism and elitism. Greek organizations were pressured to diversify. Some churches that had used the paper bag test formally apologized and changed their practices. But here's the thing. The paper bag test might have faded as an explicit practice, but colorism didn't die. It evolved. Today, colorism operates more subtly, but no less powerfully. Studies consistently show that light-skinned black people have economic advantages over darker-skinned black people. They earn more money on average. They receive shorter prison sentences for the same crimes. They're perceived as more intelligent and trustworthy. They're overrepresented in positions of leadership and in media. Look at Hollywood. For decades, light-skinned black actresses like Halle Berry, Zendaya, and Zoe Saldana have dominated leading roles, while darker-skinned actresses struggled for the same opportunities. It's only in recent years, with actresses like Lupita Nyong'o, Viola Davis, and Danielle Brooks breaking through that we've seen more diversity in black female representation. The same pattern exists in music, fashion, business, and politics. Light-skinned black people are often treated as more palatable to white audiences and given opportunities that darker-skinned people are denied. And within black communities, colorism still causes pain. Darker-skinned black people, particularly women, report feeling less desirable, less valued, and less seen. Light-skinned black people, particularly men, are often preferred as romantic partners. Entire conversations happen on social media about who counts as attractive based on skin tone. The paper bag test might be gone, but its ghost haunts us. So where did this all come from? Why did black people internalize these racist standards and turn them on each other? The answer is simple and devastating: white supremacy. Colorism within black communities didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was a direct product of a society that treated whiteness as superior and blackness as inferior. When lighter skin gave you access to education, jobs, safety, and dignity, that darker skin didn't. People adapted. They tried to position themselves and their families to survive. This doesn't excuse the paper bag test or the cruelty of colorism, but it explains it. The real villains weren't the black sororities or churches or families who enforced these standards. The real villain was the racist system that made those standards seem rational. During slavery, white enslavers created the hierarchy. During segregation, white society maintained it. Light-skinned black people weren't inherently better at anything, but they were treated better. And over time, some came to believe they deserved that treatment. They internalized the logic of white supremacy and used it against their own people. This is how oppression works. It doesn't just attack from the outside. It gets inside your head. It makes you police each other. It makes you turn your community's survival strategies into new forms of violence. The paper bag test was never just about a bag. It was about a society so poisoned by racism that even a grocery bag could become a weapon. One of the most disturbing aspects of the paper bag test is how specific and visual it was. There were variations across different contexts, but they all relied on visual markers that could be assessed at a glance. The paper bag itself was chosen because it represented a middle ground. It was brown, but not too dark. It was roughly the color of someone with mixed African and European ancestry, someone who might be called mulatto in the language of the time. That shade became the cutoff point, the line between acceptable and unacceptable. But what shade of brown paper bag? There was no standardization. A bag from one store might be slightly lighter or darker than a bag from another store. The test was already absurd, but its lack of consistency made it even more arbitrary. Your acceptability could literally depend on where someone bought their groceries that day. Some organizations tried to be more scientific about it. They used paint swatches or fabric samples as references, but this just added a veneer of legitimacy to something fundamentally irrational. The blue vein test was even more invasive. Someone would grab your wrist or arm and examine the inside, looking for visible veins. This was based on the idea that lighter skin is more translucent, allowing veins to show through. Darker skin, being richer in melanin, would obscure the veins. The comb test targeted hair texture, another marker of racial mixture. Straight or wavy hair, associated with European ancestry, was desirable. Kinky or tightly coiled hair, African in origin, was not. A fine-tooth comb became the judge. If your hair broke the comb or stopped its progress, you failed. These tests weren't occasional or sporadic. In some communities and organizations, they were routine. Everyone knew about them. People prepared for them. Light-skinned individuals knew they had an advantage and sometimes flaunted it. Darker-skinned people knew they would be rejected and either avoided those spaces or endured the humiliation. Children grew up watching this. They learned early that their skin color would determine how they were treated, not just by white people, but by black people too. They learned to evaluate their own worth based on a paper bag. The psychological impact of the paper bag test extended across generations. Dark-skinned black people who lived through this era carry scars. Many have spoken about the experience of being rejected by their own community, of being told they were too dark to belong. In interviews and oral histories, darker-skinned black people describe feeling worthless, ugly, and inferior. They talk about avoiding mirrors, hating their reflection, and wishing they could change their skin. Some tried dangerous skin-lightening products using bleaching creams that contained toxic chemicals like mercury and hydroquinone. These products promised lighter skin and, supposedly, better treatment. What they delivered was chemical burns, scarring, and long-term health problems. Light-skinned black people had their own complicated relationship with colorism. Some benefited from it and accepted their privileges without question. Others felt guilty or conflicted, knowing they were receiving opportunities not because of merit, but because of luck in the genetic lottery. And some light-skinned black people were told they weren't black enough, that they had it too easy, that they couldn't understand real racism. Colorism created a no-win situation. Dark-skinned people were excluded and devalued. Light-skinned people were granted conditional access, but faced accusations of not being authentically black. Everyone was trapped in a hierarchy that served no one except white supremacy. Families fractured along color lines. Dark-skinned children were treated differently than their light-skinned siblings. Parents played favorites based on skin tone. Extended family members made cruel comments disguised as jokes. Don't stay out in the sun too long. You're already dark enough. We need to find you a light-skinned husband to improve the family. Thank God the baby came out light. These comments were normalized. People didn't see them as abuse because colorism was so deeply embedded in the culture. But the damage was real. Entire therapeutic practices today focus on helping black people, particularly black women, heal from colorist trauma. The paper bag test also had economic consequences that shaped wealth accumulation in black communities. Access to elite institutions meant access to networks that controlled economic opportunities. If you couldn't get into the right fraternity or sorority, if you couldn't join the right church or social club, you were cut off from the people who could help you get a good job, start a business, or invest in property. In cities with large black populations like Washington, D.C., Atlanta, New Orleans, and Chicago, light-skinned black families dominated the economic elite. They owned businesses that catered to black customers. They held professional positions as doctors, lawyers, and teachers. They lived in the best black neighborhoods, the ones closest to white areas and furthest from the poorest black communities. This created a class system within segregated black society. At the top were light-skinned, educated, wealthy black families who sometimes called themselves the talented tenth, borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois' concept. Below them were darker-skinned, working-class black people who did manual labor and domestic work. The talented tenth often looked down on working-class black people, considering them uncouth and embarrassing. They worried that the behavior of poor black people would reflect badly on all black people and make white people even more racist. So they distanced themselves socially and geographically from darker and poorer black communities. This created resentment that still exists today. Working-class black people saw the black elite as traitors, as people who had abandoned their race for proximity to whiteness. And they had a point. Some light-skinned black people did try to pass as white when possible, benefiting from segregation's cruelty while abandoning the people who couldn't pass. But it's important to note that even the lightest-skinned, wealthiest black people still faced racism. They might have privileges within black communities, but in white society, they were still considered inferior. They still couldn't vote in many states. They still couldn't eat at white restaurants or stay at white hotels. They still faced violence from white mobs. The paper bag test gave them advantages over other black people, but it didn't make them white. This is the tragedy of colorism. It divided people who should have been united against a common enemy. Instead of all black people fighting white supremacy together, they fought each other over scraps of conditional acceptance. Entertainment venues were major sites of paper bag test enforcement. The Cotton Club in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s is a famous example. This nightclub featured black performers, but only admitted white patrons and light-skinned black patrons. Dark-skinned black people were explicitly excluded, even though black artists were the main attraction. Duke Ellington, Cab, Calloway, Lena Horne, and other black legends performed at the Cotton Club for white audiences who came to Harlem to experience black culture without actually mixing with most black people. The few black patrons who were allowed in had to pass the paper bag test or be celebrities themselves. Other clubs and venues across the country had similar policies. In New Orleans, blue vein societies controlled access to balls and parties. In Washington, D.C., certain social events required the right skin tone for entry. In Chicago, some black and tan clubs, which catered to mixed-race crowds, still enforced color hierarchies. These weren't just parties. They were networking events where people made business deals, formed romantic relationships, and built social capital. Being excluded meant losing out on opportunities that could change your life. Black businesses sometimes practiced colorism too. Some barbershops and beauty salons catered exclusively to light-skinned clientele. Some stores hired only light-skinned employees to work in customer-facing roles, relegating darker-skinned employees to the back or refusing to hire them at all. This was economic racism within racial lines. And it worked because colorism was profitable. Light-skinned employees were thought to attract more customers, both black and white. They made businesses seem more respectable and successful. Dark-skinned employees, especially in visible positions, were seen as bad for business. The beauty industry both reflected and reinforced colorism. Advertisements in black newspapers from the early to mid-1900s are painful to read today. They promised that lighter skin would bring success, romance, and happiness. They sold skin bleaching creams with names like Black and White Bleaching Cream and Nadanola. They featured before and after photos showing dark-skinned women transformed into light-skinned women with copy that read, like salvation narratives. I used to be dark and lonely, now I'm light and popular. This was the message, repeated endlessly, and people believed it because their lived experience confirmed it. Light-skinned people did have advantages. The ads weren't lying about that. They were just offering a toxic solution. Madame C.J. Walker, who became one of the first self-made female millionaires in America by selling hair care products to black women in the early 1900s, is often criticized for selling products that promoted straightening black hair. But Walker herself was dark-skinned and vocally opposed skin bleaching. Her business promoted hair health and economic independence for black women, even if some of her products catered to Eurocentric beauty standards. The tension in Walker's legacy reflects the larger tension in black beauty culture during this era. People were trying to survive in a world that devalued black features, and they made complicated choices to do so. Religious institutions were supposed to be places of refuge, but many churches enforced the paper bag test with the same vigor as social clubs. This might be the most painful aspect of the whole phenomenon, because churches are meant to embody acceptance and love. Some black churches in elite neighborhoods were known as paper bag churches or blue vein churches. These congregations had formal or informal policies about who could join. If you were too dark, you were encouraged to worship elsewhere. Ministers at these churches often came from light-skinned families. Deacons, choir directors, and other leadership positions went to light-skinned members. Church weddings, baptisms, and social events were dominated by the light-skinned elite. Darker-skinned black people founded their own churches in response. These congregations tended to be more working class, more openly emotional in worship style, and more connected to African religious traditions that elite churches tried to distance themselves from. This created a religious divide that mirrored the social and economic divide. Respectable, refined, light-skinned black people attended one type of church. Darker-skinned, working-class black people attended another. Even in communion with God, colorism intruded. Some churches eventually confronted their colorist histories. In recent decades, several historically black churches have acknowledged that they practice the paper bag test and have formally apologized. These apologies are important, but they can't undo generations of damage. The paper bag test began to decline in the 1960s and 1970s for several reasons. The civil rights movement challenged all forms of racial hierarchy, including those within black communities. The Black Power movement celebrated blackness explicitly, making colorism less socially acceptable. And integration, while incomplete and imperfect, gave black people more opportunities outside of exclusively black institutions, reducing the power of those institutions to enforce color boundaries. But the decline was slow and uneven. Some organizations stopped using explicit tests, but continued to favor light-skinned members through unspoken preferences, and colorism adapted to new contexts. In the 1980s and 1990s, hip-hop culture initially seemed to challenge colorism by centering darker-skinned artists and celebrating African features. But as hip-hop became more commercial, light-skinned women began to dominate music videos and red carpets. The video vixen aesthetic favored light skin, long hair, and racially ambiguous features. Reality television in the 2000s and 2010s continued this pattern. Shows like Love and Hip Hop and the Real Housewives franchises featured predominantly light-skinned black women. When darker-skinned women appeared, they were often portrayed as aggressive, unfeminine, or less desirable. Social media has made colorism both more visible and more persistent. Hashtags like Black is Beautiful and Melanin Poppin' celebrate dark skin, and movements like Black Girl Magic have created space for darker-skinned Black women to be affirmed. But social media also allows colorist attitudes to spread quickly, and online dating studies show that dark-skinned Black women and Black men face discrimination on dating apps. The paper bag test might be gone, but its logic persists every time a lighter-skinned Black person is chosen over a darker-skinned person with equal qualifications. Every time someone says they prefer light-skinned dudes or red bones. Every time a Black child is told they're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. What can be done about colorism? The answer isn't simple, because colorism is rooted in systems of power that are larger than any individual or community. First, we have to acknowledge it. For too long, colorism was the secret Black people didn't talk about publicly. It was painful and embarrassing, and there was fear that discussing it would give ammunition to racists. But silence only allowed colorism to fester. In recent years, more Black people have been willing to talk openly about colorism, and that's essential. Second, we have to actively counter colorist attitudes. This means calling out colorism when we see it, even when it's uncomfortable. It means examining our own biases about skin tone and beauty. It means supporting darker-skinned Black people in spaces where they're underrepresented. And it means teaching children that all shades of Blackness are beautiful. Third, we have to address the structural issues that make colorism profitable. As long as lighter-skinned Black people have economic and social advantages, colorism will persist. That means pushing for diversity in media representation, in hiring practices, in leadership positions, and in cultural narratives about what Black beauty looks like. Finally, we have to remember that colorism is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is white supremacy. Colorism will only truly end when we dismantle the racist systems that created hierarchies based on proximity to whiteness in the first place. The paper bag test is history, but history isn't really past. It lives in the present, in the ways we see ourselves and each other. Every time a Black person looks in the mirror and wishes they were lighter, the paper bag test wins. Every time a darker-skinned person is passed over for an opportunity, the paper bag test wins. Every time we internalize the idea that Blackness is something to be diluted or improved upon, the paper bag test wins. But it doesn't have to. We can choose to reject the logic that ever made a paper bag a measure of worth. We can choose to celebrate the full spectrum of Black beauty. We can choose to build communities where everyone is welcome, regardless of their shade. The paper bag test was never about paper bags. It was about power, about who gets to belong, and about how deeply racism can reach into our psyche. Understanding that history is the first step toward healing from it. Because at the end of the day, a brown paper bag is just a brown paper bag. It should hold groceries, not dreams. It should carry food, not futures. The fact that it ever became more than that is a testament to how twisted colorism is, and how far we still have to go to undo its damage. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.